Good evening, church. It's Wednesday night. Today is Wednesday the 12th, and we are wrapping up or getting close to the end of this long session of the Greco-Roman world and what it was like for the first, or nearing the first century, into the first century. And so I hope to finish today. If not, I'll finish it up next week. And then, depending on what the schedule looks like for the rest of the June and July and all, may go into how the Christian movement, and I probably should make every effort to do this, how the Christian movement, talk about with more detail, how the Christian movement actually played, what role and how it played this role into as it arrived on the scene in the first century. That's also very interesting material, and so it just depends on what the schedule is. We're short one minister, and so, but we'll see. But that's the goal, is to, once I'm done with this last portion, is to go into the next section of Christianity, arriving into the Greco-Roman world. So I am ready with my Starburst and my bag of Skittles and some of my reading material. So most times I show up with some reading materials, and just so I can glance to remind me where I'm supposed to be in this topic. As we get into this last portion, here in this country, when we think about nationalism, we think about it as, as an ideology that is based on the idea that individuals' loyalty and devotion to this country surpasses all other individual or group rights or interests. And so we envelop, or we project much of who we are into our country, into our nation, and we have this loyalty and devotion to our nation, and the nation surpasses, or the loyalty and devotion to the nation is greater than any one individual, and also the interests of other countries. And so, and that there's this battle or debate that's taking place in our country, whether we should be concerned with other interests outside of our country, or whether we should be more inclusive of others in our world, and so this is rather strong debate. And so one of the reasons for that is because it depends, I guess, on your ideology, but it goes back to this idea of nationalism, that our country and what it stands for and all those things needs to be preserved. And so there is this segment of society, like Matt used to say, good, wrong, or indifferent. There's a segment of society that really believes that in our nation, and it ought to be all things of our nation should surpass any entity that may threaten it, and to include other nations. So, in essence, nationalism, again, I go back to, it means the ideology that is based on the premise that the individual's loyalty and our devotion to our country surpasses all individual or other group or country's interest, and we see that being debated among our country. So what does that have to do with anything? Well, although nationalism, in the sense that we understand it in this country, nationalism in the sense that we use the word, really did not exist in ancient times. See, most people had a reverence for some deities, which for deities or gods with a small g, they had some reverence towards these gods, which they connected with their own country or their own nation. And so they also connected other nations that lived around them with their own sets of deities or their own gods. So in the minds of Romans, those deities were connected with those people in an intimate way, and were part of the overall working of the world. Now, order was maintained. I guess you can call it law and order. Law and order was maintained when they worshiped their own body of Roman deities, and then when the Greeks worshiped the Greek deities, and the Etruscans, the Etruscan deities, and so on and so forth. And so the gods played a large role in their nations and they allowed each nation, they allowed each other and each nation to worship their own deities because they believed that it created the sense of order and connection to society. So while now the Romans, they expected other Romans to make offerings to the Roman gods, they did not expect the Greeks or the Etruscans to do the same thing to the Roman gods. It was acceptable for each nation to worship its own gods with a little g, according to its own traditions. And so they didn't really make all that big of a deal about other countries worshiping their own gods, because they believed that by allowing them to worship their own gods, it created this sense of order in society. Now, there was a good deal, there was a good deal of overlap among the religious practices of the ancient world. As Romans, for example, they interacted more often with the Greeks. We know that by history. They began to view Greek deities in terms of their own and vice versa. In fact, they developed systems of identity and mapping of Roman deities to Greek and back and forth. And a couple of weeks ago, I showed you a list of the Roman gods and the Greek gods and how and how some of the gods cross-pollinated, I guess, in a sense, to each other. So the idea that gods could be known by different names and the same rites performed by different peoples, it became a really important and interconnected, integral part of their religious worldview. In many ways, one could say that the people or the peoples who lived in what became the Roman Empire started out with different religions, but ended up worshiping different aspects of the same basic pool of religious notions and practices. All right? Now, this made everyone naturally pluralistic, meaning multiplicity of gods. Exclusivity was not demanded, and I've mentioned that before, so it was not really relevant to the Romans or even to the Greco-Roman world at large. Now, some people did participate in the vast polytheistic religion pool. We mentioned that a few weeks back. And so we mentioned how the Jews and the Zoroastrians were monotheistic. And we mentioned how the Romans and the Greeks allowed that to happen because, again, their God, the Jews and the Zoroastrians' God, was every part of their nation. And again, the Romans believed that it created a sense of order. So the Jews believed in a deity which they presumed to be singular in nation, which is our God Yahweh. And I mentioned that before. And the sole God of the world. Now, the Zoroastrians also had a sole God. And I mentioned that a few weeks ago. And so I'm kind of recapping what I mentioned a few weeks ago in order to get to where I want to get to. So anyway, if it seems repetitive, it's been a couple of weeks since I covered that, and so I'm kind of trying to get back to just a basic understanding or reminder of where we once were. All right, so that's why I'm talking about that. Anyway, talking about something I had already covered. So let's get back to the class. So the average Greco-Roman polytheist, then, he stood at something of an impasse because they started getting to a place where they weren't sure if polytheism was actually helpful to them as they became more educated. So by the first century, few people were willing to give up on their traditional deities since they were so close to, and I guess in their view, they were so close to peril or even collapse. I mean, they lived a very, I don't know if barbaric is the right way to say it, but they lived in a very precarious time. And so they believed that the deities prevented for them from falling off the cliff. And so when there were other people talking about more of the monotheistic or even questioning the polytheistic view of the gods, it created a sense of disorder in them. And so even though more people started believing in or questioning polytheism, the Romans still held on, or at Greco-Roman world still held on to it as tightly as they could for as long as they could, because they just felt that if they didn't, that things would not be successful for them. So I guess you could say that if you're a betting person, I guess you could say that they were basically hedging their bets. But over time, this became a cultural dependency. By that I mean a perceived need to keep pleasing the gods and risk, or they were going to risk disaster. It basically became cultural to believe and hold on to the idea of polytheism. So over time, I guess you could say this became a cultural dependency, this idea of polytheism, and it was perceived as needing polytheism in order to keep pleasing the gods, because if they didn't please the gods, at least in their worldview, they risked disaster. So that's why I go back to the idea that they were, even though they were starting to question polytheism, they were hedging their bets because it just became part of culture. And so there was this fear that if they didn't, things wouldn't go very well for them. And so that's why I said a second ago that the average Greco-Roman polytheist then, he kind of stood at something of an impasse, because they knew enough about the world to know that the deities did not, in fact, control everything. They understood that some natural mechanisms, which for centuries or maybe a millennia before had been chalked up to the deities. And so they struggle with the idea of polytheism and questioning in them and moving away from them, and also all being ostracized from society and maybe even persecuted or convicted and put to death. So, but some had even decided that many of the gods were merely a reflection of a single incomprehensible divine force. We call it God. At that point in time, they weren't sure what to call it. Yet they simply did not understand their world well enough to know or do away with their belief in spirits and deities altogether. It was that time that time of being educated and learning more. And so as they learned more and understood more, they started seeing some discrepancies in their polytheism worldview. But again, I go back to the idea that it creates this schism inside them, whether they should continue or whether they should not continue to believe them as they once did. So again, we go back to the idea there were some people that pretty much were there and were understanding that maybe their view of the world was actually a reflection of a single divine force, but that we call God. And so that was at that time, a period of debate whether that existed. And I go back to, like I mentioned a few weeks back, sometimes it can be very dangerous, could have been very dangerous to your life. So academic philosophers such as Plato and Aristotle and some of the rest of them and some of the others might speculate that the spirits and deities either did not exist or were not relevant. And some of the rest of the population might have been educated just enough to know about this, but pragmatically, the Greco-Roman population behaved as if the gods with a small g did exist, and they were relevant to everyday life, even though they were questioning or speculating that polytheism wasn't really helpful to their society. Now, someone might ask, why why would the ancient Greek and Romans, why would they maintain a dependency on a system of beliefs which, in lots of ways, they pretty much no longer needed and had at least begun to speculate that it was irrelevant? Well, there's probably two reasons. One is the reason of need, N-E-E-D, and also their success. So, although the ancients had mastered the world to I guess you can call it a remarkable extent. I mean, for that day and age, I mean, they had mastered everything from infrastructure to society to education. And so, even though they had mastered a lot of what was going on in their worlds, and they had built these massive works, and they had built these massive cities, and had attained, and I guess you could call it unprecedented a level of population, the world could still be very, very hostile to them. It was basically a world of constant battle and war. So the possibility of, let's just say, famine, or droughts, or floods, or earthquakes, etc. I mean, you name it. All of that hovered around them just constantly. And most people lived at a subsistence level and just had one. And so if they had just one bad crop season, it could literally mean death to them. So many in the ancient world hovered on this fringe, on the edge of survival. So this meant that any edge, no matter how slim or how far they were from that edge, that the gods granted them a good deal of comfort. So that was one reason probably why they held on to the system, because of this idea that life, and as they knew, was constantly a battle and on the edge, and any little displeasure of the gods could push them over the edge. That this having this idea or this view of the gods and how it played in their lives provided them lots of comfort and reassurance. So also the conquest of the Roman legions, and to an extent Alexander before them, were seen as, well, it was seen as phenomenal, even in their own time. So people were historically aware enough to realize that no state had ever expanded so far and brought so many people and places into contact with one another. So they had come to experience, this expansion of their cities and their populations, this expansion of their communities, really, to them it was phenomenal. And so it really put them, I guess you could say, somewhat not at ease, but created some tension. And so it goes back to then the gods gave them comfort during this massive undertaking and this massive collection of peoples and cities. And so that was another reason. So this idea of this expansion and the population and all this growth, all that took place. I mean, when you look at history books, I mean, it was spoken of as an era of awe. Like, I'm in awe of what has taken place. There was lots of amazement that this was taking place, this quick revolution, if you will, this quick growth and all those things that went along with it. It's like for us, when we are amazed at technology and how the advancements that technology has made in our country and in our world, it amazes us. We're in awe. As to less than 20 years, that most of the world is able to talk on the phone or speak on the phone. It has more computing power than the first mission to Mars. And so as they saw the world rapidly changing, they were in awe and amazement, just like we are now at awe and amazement at how fast technology is moving. So this success was attributed to many factors, among which were the Roman deities. They believed that the reason they were able to have such success and expansion and growth was because the deities were smiling on them. That the deities had helped them on the way and were revealing their power to them. So by the first century then, few people were willing to give up on the traditional deities. The reason, again, I mentioned this a couple of times, and I'm trying to drill it in. The reason why they were unwilling, or why majority of them were unwilling to give up on the traditional deities is they were so close, again, they were so close to peril, and because the Roman gods had been so successful, these people were, I guess you could say, what I said a couple of minutes ago was, again, they were hedging their bets. So over time, though, this became a cultural dependency again and perceived a need to keep pleasing the gods, or again, like I said a second ago, or they would risk disaster. It always went back to hedging their bets. They were seeing discrepancies in their gods. They were questioning their gods, but you just never know. And so they kept on holding on to polytheism. So in a couple of, hopefully next week, what we'll do is then we're going to introduce the Christians into this world and talk a little bit about what it was like maybe for them and for the people that have started to experience, or the Greco-Roman citizens in the world that started to experience this new Christian movement that was taking place. All right? Well, thank you for your time. I'm glad I was able to complete this last segment, and I look forward to future segments. And I appreciate for those of you that watch each week. It's a sizable group of people that watch this video each week, and I sincerely appreciate you taking the time out to take this journey with me. All right, God bless, and I hope you have a great rest of the week.